The White House stands at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, one of the most recognized buildings in the world. The neoclassical facade, the iconic columns, the perfectly manicured grounds. Over 200 years of American history have unfolded within its walls and on its grounds, but before it was painted white, before it housed presidents, before it became a symbol of American democracy, it was a construction site. The building rose slowly from swampy ground along the Potomac River. The work took years. The labor came from multiple sources, both free and enslaved. This is the story of how the White House was built, the political compromises that determined its location, the architectural competition that selected its design, the Irish architect who drew the plans, the craftsmen and laborers, some paid and some enslaved, who turned those plans into stone and timber, the fire that nearly destroyed it, the Reconstruction that made it what we recognize today. The building's history is complicated. It was constructed during a period when slavery was legal in much of the United States. Some of the people who built it were enslaved. That reality is part of the story, neither to be ignored nor sensationalized, but understood as historical fact. The White House took shape between 1792 and 1800, with major reconstruction after 1814. Understanding how and why it was built requires understanding the young nation that commissioned it. The compromises, the constraints, the ambitions, all shaped the building that emerged. If you're interested in architectural history and how America's most famous residents came to exist, please consider subscribing. I would also love if you gave a comment if you have additional insights on the story of the White House. Let's begin with the decision that made everything else possible: where to build the nation's new capital. Choosing the site, a capital in a swamp. When the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, the new federal government had no permanent home. Congress had met in various cities: Philadelphia, New York, Princeton, Annapolis. The question of where to establish a permanent capital became a significant political issue. The Compromise of 1790 resolved the matter. Alexander Hamilton needed Southern votes to pass his financial plan, which included the federal government assuming state debts from the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wanted the capital located in the South, rather than in northern cities like Philadelphia or New York. The compromise was reportedly straightforward. Hamilton got his financial plan. Jefferson and Madison got a southern capital. The location would be along the Potomac River, on land ceded by Maryland and Virginia. President George Washington was given authority to select the specific site within a designated area. Washington chose a location that included existing settlements at Georgetown and Alexandria. The area was not ideal by many measures. Much of the land was swampy. The terrain was uneven. Summers were reportedly hot and humid. The Potomac could flood. But the location had political advantages that outweighed practical concerns. The Potomac site placed the capital between North and South, a geographic compromise meant to balance regional interests. The location was also near Washington's home at Mount Vernon. Washington knew the area well and apparently believed it could be developed successfully despite the challenging terrain. The Residence Act of 1790 authorized creation of a federal district not exceeding 10 miles square. Washington selected the specific boundaries, chosen to include Georgetown, which was already an established port town. The federal district would be carved from land that Maryland and Virginia would cede to the federal government. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant was hired to design the new city. L'Enfant was a French-born engineer who had served in the Continental Army during the Revolution. His plan for the capital was ambitious, featuring wide avenues, grand public spaces, and carefully planned sightlines. The design drew on European city planning, particularly Paris, adapted to American circumstances and Republican ideals. L'Enfant's plan included a president's house and a Capitol building as the two major structures. The president's house would sit on elevated ground with views of the Potomac River. The location offered both practical advantages and symbolic positioning. The president's residence would be visible but not dominating, grand but not monarchical. The actual site selected for the president's house was reportedly chosen by Washington himself. The ground was higher than much of the surrounding area, providing better drainage and views. The location placed the house at an appropriate distance from the Capitol, connected by Pennsylvania Avenue, the main ceremonial route L'Enfant envisioned. But the site came with challenges. The ground required extensive preparation. Drainage had to be addressed. The terrain needed leveling in some areas. The location, while elevated relative to surroundings, was still in a region where summers were uncomfortable and winters could be harsh. Building anything substantial would require significant effort and resources. The decision to build the Capitol in what was essentially wilderness rather than in an established city reflected both idealism and compromise. The new nation wanted a capital that wasn't dominated by existing commercial or social interests. A purpose-built city could embody Republican principles in its very layout and architecture. But building from nothing also meant creating infrastructure where little existed. Roads, bridges, water systems all had to be constructed. Workers had to be recruited or transported. Materials had to be sourced and delivered. The challenges were substantial, and the young federal government had limited resources. The timeline was tight. The government was scheduled to move to the new capital in 1800. That gave approximately 10 years to design and construct the essential buildings and infrastructure. For a major public building like the President's House, that was an extremely compressed schedule. Washington understood the challenges but apparently remained committed to the Potomac location. He worked closely with the commissioners appointed to oversee development of the federal district. The site was chosen. The plan was approved. The next step was determining what the President's House would actually look like. The competition, designing a President's House. In 1792, the commissioners overseeing development of the federal district announced an architectural competition for the President's House. The competition was advertised in newspapers, inviting architects to submit designs. The winner would receive $500 or a medal of that value, a substantial prize for the period. The competition instructions specified certain requirements. The house needed to accommodate both the president's private residence and official functions. It should be substantial enough to represent the young nation's dignity, but not so grand as to suggest monarchy. The building should be constructed of brick or stone for permanence and fire resistance. The instructions left considerable room for interpretation. How large should the house be? What architectural style was appropriate for a republic? How should the building balance private and public functions? These questions fell to the competing architects to answer through their designs. Multiple designs were submitted, though the exact number varies in different historical accounts. Most submissions have not survived or remain unidentified. What's known is that the submitted designs varied considerably in scale, style, and ambition. Some were relatively modest. Others proposed palace-like structures that seemed unsuitable for a republic. Thomas Jefferson submitted a design anonymously. Jefferson was deeply interested in architecture and had strong opinions about what buildings should express. His design drew on classical Roman precedents, particularly Palladio's Villa Rotonda. The proposal featured a central dome and relatively restrained classical elements. Jefferson's design emphasized Republican simplicity over grandeur. Jefferson's submission was not selected. The reasons are not entirely clear from historical records, but the design may have been considered too modest or too obviously derivative of European models. Jefferson's architectural preferences, while influential later, didn't win the competition for the President's House. Other submitted designs reportedly included proposals for elaborate structures with extensive ornamentation, buildings that would have rivaled European palaces. These were apparently rejected as too monarchical, too expensive, or simply impractical given the timeline and available resources. The winning design came from James Hoban, an Irish-born architect working in Charleston, South Carolina. Hoban's proposal apparently struck the balance the commissioners sought. The design was substantial without being overwhelming. It drew on classical precedents but adapted them to American circumstances. It could accommodate both private residence and public functions. Hoban's design featured a rectangular plan with a central section and two projecting wings. The style was Georgian, a restrained neoclassical approach that was familiar in both Britain and America. The facade would feature evenly spaced windows. classical proportions, and relatively simple ornamentation. The design suggested dignity and permanence without monarchical pretension. The selection process involved both the commissioners and President Washington. Washington's preferences apparently influenced the final choice. He had strong opinions about the Capitol's development and took active interest in the President's House design. Washington's approval of Hoban's plan was essential to its selection. The competition revealed tensions about what the President's House should represent. Too modest, and it might diminish the nation's dignity. Too grand, and it might suggest the President was becoming a monarch. The selected design attempted to navigate between these concerns, creating a building that was impressive but not overwhelming, permanent but not oppressive. Hoban's winning design would guide construction, though modifications would occur during building. The basic form, the proportions, the general character all came from the competition entry. The selection determined what would rise on the prepared site along the Potomac. The competition also established that American public architecture would draw heavily on European precedents while attempting to adapt them to Republican principles. The President's House would look classical because classical architecture suggested permanence, order, and connection to ancient Republican Rome. But it would be American in its specific expression and its careful avoidance of monarchical grandeur. James Hoban, the Irish architect's vision. James Hoban was born in Ireland around 1758. He trained as an architect and builder, reportedly learning his craft in Dublin. Ireland in the 18th century had substantial architectural activity, with neoclassical buildings rising in Dublin and other cities. Hoban's training exposed him to Georgian architecture, the restrained classical style that dominated British and Irish building during that period. Hoban immigrated to America after the Revolutionary War, settling in Philadelphia before moving to Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was a prosperous port city with active construction. Hoban established himself there, designing and building houses for wealthy clients. His work demonstrated competence in the Georgian style he'd learned in Ireland. When the competition for the President's House was announced, Hoban was reportedly in Philadelphia on business. He learned of the competition and decided to enter. His experience and training made him well qualified. He understood classical proportions, could execute designs in stone or brick, and had actually built substantial structures rather than just drawing plans. Hoban's winning design drew inspiration from Leinster House in Dublin. Leinster House, built in the 1740s, was the residence of the Duke of Leinster. The building featured a similar rectangular plan, Georgian facade, and classical proportions to what Hoban proposed for the President's House. Hoban adapted rather than copied, modifying Leinster House's design for American circumstances and Republican purposes. The design featured 3 stories. The ground floor would contain service and utility spaces. The main floor, accessed by a grand staircase, would hold the primary public rooms. The upper floor would provide private quarters for the President's family. This vertical arrangement separated public and private functions while keeping everything under one roof. The facade followed Georgian principles: symmetrical window arrangement, central entrance with classical portico, restrained ornamentation focusing on proportion rather than elaborate decoration. The design achieved grandeur through scale and proportion rather than through ornate details. This approach suited both available resources and Republican principles. Hoban's plan included substantial interior spaces. A large entrance hall would run through the center of the building. Major rooms would open off this central space, including what would become the East Room, the largest space in the house designed for public gatherings and formal entertainments. The state dining room would accommodate official dinners. Smaller rooms would serve various official and private purposes. The design was practical as well as symbolic. The rectangular plan with projecting wings created a building that could be constructed in stages if necessary. The Georgian style used familiar construction techniques. The materials specified, stone for exterior walls and timber for interior structure and floors, were available in the region or could be transported relatively easily. After winning the competition, Hoban became superintendent of construction for the President's House. He would oversee the entire building process, from preparing the site to final finishing work. This role gave Hoban substantial control over how his design was realized, though he would also face pressures to modify plans as construction progressed and budgets tightened. Hoban's relationship with President Washington reportedly shaped some aspects of the design. Washington wanted the building larger than Hoban's original competition entry proposed. Hoban modified his plans, increasing the overall dimensions while maintaining the basic design principles. The changes made the building more impressive, but also more expensive and time-consuming to construct. The architectural choices Hoban made would influence American public buildings for generations. The Georgian style, the classical proportions, the emphasis on symmetry and restrained ornament all became standard for government architecture. Hoban's design established patterns that countless later buildings would follow or reference. Hoban's work on the President's House would occupy years. The construction would proceed slowly, facing numerous challenges. But Hoban's vision, his design principles, and his practical execution would determine what emerged. The building that stands today reflects Hoban's training, his aesthetic preferences, and his adaptation of Irish-Georgian architecture to American purposes and circumstances. Breaking ground, the foundation and early construction. Construction of the President's House officially began on October 13, 1792. The cornerstone was laid in a ceremony that marked the start of major building operations. The date was carefully chosen, occurring on the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, linking the new building to themes of discovery and national foundation. The actual ceremony was reportedly modest. President Washington was present, along with commissioners overseeing the federal district development and local officials. The cornerstone itself was placed, though its exact location within the foundation has been lost to history. Later attempts to locate the original cornerstone during renovations have been unsuccessful. Before construction could begin properly, the site required extensive preparation. The ground needed leveling in some areas. Drainage had to be addressed to prevent water problems in the foundation. Trees and vegetation had to be cleared. The work was labor-intensive and took considerable time before the actual building could rise. The foundation was built from stone. The walls would sit on substantial foundations designed to support the building's weight and prevent settling. The foundation work was critical and time-consuming. Poor foundation work could compromise the entire structure. Hoban supervised carefully, ensuring the work met necessary standards. Stone for the exterior walls came from quarries at Aquia Creek in Virginia, approximately 40 miles from the building site. The Aquia Creek sandstone was relatively soft and easy to carve, but durable enough for construction purposes. The stone had a warm, slightly tan color that would characterize the building before it was later painted white. Transporting stone from the quarries to the building site involved significant logistics. The stone traveled by water when possible, moved on barges and boats along waterways. From the Potomac River, it had to be unloaded and transported to the building site. Each stone block was heavy and awkward. Moving large quantities required careful organization and substantial labor. The stone arrived at the site as rough blocks. Stonecutters shaped the blocks to precise dimensions for their specific locations in the building. This work required skill and experience. Cutting stone to proper dimensions and achieving the smooth surfaces required for the facade's exterior demanded trained craftsmen. The workforce assembling for the construction was diverse in both skills and legal status. Skilled craftsmen, including stonecutters, masons, and carpenters, were essential. Many of these skilled workers were free men, often immigrants with European training. They worked for wages and could leave the project if they chose, though finding alternative employment in the undeveloped capital area was difficult. But skilled free labor was insufficient for the scale of work required. The project also employed laborers for less skilled tasks: digging, hauling, mixing mortar, moving materials. Some of these laborers were free workers, paid daily or weekly wages. Others were enslaved workers, hired from their owners or owned by contractors working on the building. The use of enslaved labor on the President's House was documented in payroll records and other contemporary documents. The federal government paid slave owners for their enslaved workers' time. The payments went to the owners, not to the enslaved individuals doing the work. This arrangement was common in the region and period, though it troubles modern understanding of how America's most symbolic building was constructed. The early construction progressed slowly. The foundation work took months. The stone walls rose gradually as blocks were shaped, positioned, and mortared into place. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. Stone blocks were heavy and unwieldy. Scaffolding was basic and sometimes unstable. Injuries occurred, though specific records of accidents during construction are scarce. Weather affected the construction schedule significantly. Heavy rain could halt outdoor work. Winter cold made some tasks difficult or impossible. The building site in winter would have been muddy, cold, and uncomfortable. Summer heat along the Potomac was oppressive. The workers, particularly those doing heavy physical labor, faced challenging conditions regardless of season. Progress was visible but slow. By the end of 1793, the foundation was largely complete and walls were beginning to rise. By 1794, the exterior walls were taking shape, but the work was far from finished. Years of construction still lay ahead before the building would be habitable. The workforce. The construction of the President's House required a large workforce over many years. Understanding who built the building means examining both the free craftsmen who worked for wages and the enslaved individuals who worked under compulsion. The historical record preserves some information about both groups, though documentation is more complete for free workers than for enslaved ones. Skilled craftsmen formed the core of the construction workforce. Stonecutters shaped the Aquia Creek sandstone into precise blocks. Masons laid the stone, ensuring proper alignment and secure mortar bonds. Carpenters framed interior spaces, built floors, constructed roof structures. Plasterers finished interior walls. Each craft required years of training and experience. Many skilled craftsmen were immigrants, particularly from Britain and Ireland. They brought European training to American projects. These workers generally received regular wages. Surviving payroll records document payments to named individuals for specific work periods. The records show that skilled craftsmen were paid substantially more than unskilled laborers, reflecting their training and the critical nature of their work. Some skilled workers were enslaved but had learned trades through apprenticeship or on-the-job training. Enslaved carpenters, masons, and blacksmiths worked on the President's House alongside free craftsmen. The distinction was legal status, not necessarily skill level. An enslaved carpenter might be as skilled as a free one, but the enslaved worker's labor benefited his owner rather than himself. Unskilled labor was required in enormous quantities: digging foundations, moving stone, hauling materials, mixing mortar, clearing debris. This work required strength and endurance, but not specialized training. Much of this unskilled labor came from enslaved workers hired by the federal government from their owners. The hiring arrangements were straightforward. Slave owners would contract with the government commissioners to provide laborers for specified periods. The government paid the owners daily or weekly rates. The owners provided food, shelter, and clothing for their enslaved workers. The enslaved individuals themselves received no direct compensation, though owners sometimes provided small rewards or incentives to encourage productivity. Payroll records preserved at the National Archives document these hiring arrangements. The records list payments to slave owners by name, specifying how many enslaved workers were provided and for what periods. What the records generally don't provide are the names of the enslaved individuals actually doing the work. The workers existed in official documents primarily as line items in payment ledgers. Some names of enslaved workers have been recovered through careful historical research. Records sometimes mention individuals by first name when documenting specific tasks or incidents. Cross-referencing various documents has allowed historians to identify some of the enslaved people who worked on the President's House, though many remain anonymous in the historical record. The working conditions on the construction site were demanding for all laborers. The work was physical and often dangerous. Tools were basic. Safety provisions were minimal by modern standards. Weather exposure was constant. Free workers could theoretically leave if conditions became intolerable, though economic necessity often kept them on the job. Enslaved workers had no such option. The distinction between free and enslaved labor created complex dynamics on the work site. Free craftsmen and enslaved laborers worked side by side on various tasks. Some free workers supervised enslaved laborers. Some enslaved craftsmen worked with considerable independence, their skills valued enough that they received relatively light supervision. The social hierarchies were complex, based on both skill and legal status. The use of enslaved labor on federal construction projects was normal for the time and place. The federal district was carved from Maryland and Virginia, both slave states. Slavery was legal and widespread in the region. The government commissioners organizing construction worked within the labor systems available to them. Those systems included slavery. Modern understanding of this history is complicated. The President's House, now the White House, is a powerful symbol of American democracy and freedom. The fact that enslaved people helped build it creates uncomfortable tension. The building represents ideals that its construction contradicted. This contradiction is historical fact, neither to be ignored nor overstated, but recognized as part of the complex reality of how the United States developed. The workforce that built the President's House included free immigrants seeking opportunity, skilled craftsmen practicing their trades, and enslaved people compelled to labor without compensation or choice. All contributed to raising the building. The free workers received wages and could build lives for themselves. The enslaved workers received nothing and remained in bondage. Both groups' labor made the building possible. Fortsætter med kapitel 6-10 næste. Skal jeg fortsætte med næste del, kapitel 6-10? Retry. C. Ja, og du kan skrive chapter og tallet før overskrift. 2/2. Building the walls. Stone, labor, and progress. The exterior walls of the President's House rose slowly between 1793 and 1797. The process required careful coordination of quarrying, transportation, stone cutting, and masonry. Each stage involved substantial labor and presented its own challenges. At the Aquia Creek quarries in Virginia, workers extracted sandstone blocks from the ground. Quarrying required knowledge of stone formation and proper extraction techniques. Workers had to identify natural fracture lines in the stone, place wedges correctly, and split blocks without shattering them. The work was skilled and dangerous. The quarried blocks were rough and oversized when extracted. Initial shaping often occurred at the quarry site to reduce weight for transportation. Workers removed obviously excess material, creating blocks that were approximately the right dimensions, but still required final finishing. This preliminary work made the blocks somewhat lighter and easier to handle during transport. Transportation from quarry to building site was a multi-stage process. The stone traveled by water when possible, loaded onto barges that moved along waterways to the Potomac River, and then to wharves near the construction site. Water transport was more efficient than overland hauling for heavy materials. Each barge could carry multiple stone blocks, though loading and unloading required careful handling to prevent damage. From the river wharves, the stone had to be moved overland to the building site. This required wagons and teams of horses or oxen. The roads were often poor, particularly in wet weather. Moving heavy stone blocks on unpaved roads was slow and difficult. Each block had to be loaded onto wagons, secured, transported, and unloaded at the construction site. At the building site, stonecutters finished the blocks to precise dimensions. This work required skill and patience. The facade stones needed smooth outer surfaces and precise edges to fit tightly together. Interior stones could be less perfect, but still had to meet structural requirements. Stonecutters worked with hammers, chisels, and other hand tools, gradually shaping each block to specification. The finished stone blocks were then lifted into position. For the lower courses of walls, lifting was manageable with basic equipment and muscle power. As the walls rose higher, scaffolding became necessary. Workers built wooden scaffolds that allowed them to work at height while providing platforms for hoisting stone blocks. The hoisting equipment was simple by modern standards. Rope, pulleys, and wooden cranes lifted the heavy blocks. Multiple workers coordinated to raise each stone, position it precisely, and lower it into place. The process was slow and required constant attention. A block dropped or positioned incorrectly could damage other work or injure workers. Masons laid the positioned blocks, working with mortar to bond them together. The mortar, made from lime, sand, and water, had to be properly mixed and applied. Too thin, and it wouldn't provide adequate bonding. Too thick, and it would be difficult to work. The masons checked alignment constantly, using levels and plumb lines to ensure walls rose straight and true. The wall construction proceeded in sections. Work focused on raising walls to a certain height in one area before moving to adjacent sections. This approach allowed for more efficient use of scaffolding and equipment. It also distributed the weight of the building more evenly, reducing risk of settling problems while construction was ongoing. Interior walls rose alongside exterior walls. The interior walls were generally brick rather than stone, as brick was less expensive and adequate for interior purposes. Bricklayers worked simultaneously with stone masons, creating the interior structure that would divide the building into rooms and support upper floors. The work proceeded regardless of season, though weather could halt or slow operations. Rain made some tasks impossible, particularly mortar work, which required dry conditions. Winter cold could freeze mortar before it set properly. Summer heat was exhausting for workers doing physical labor. The construction site was operational year-round, but productivity varied significantly with weather conditions. The workforce composition remained diverse. Free craftsmen, particularly the stonecutters and masons, were essential for skilled work. Enslaved laborers provided much of the muscle power for moving materials and assisting skilled workers. The mix of free and enslaved labor continued throughout the wall construction phase. Progress was steady but slow. By 1795, the walls had reached full height in some sections, but construction was far from complete. By 1796, the basic structure was taking recognizable form. Visitors to the site could see the building's intended shape and scale, but extensive work remained before the structure would be weatherproof, let alone habitable. The stone itself required ongoing maintenance even during construction. Aquia Creek sandstone was relatively soft. Weathering could damage exposed surfaces. Workers sometimes had to repair or replace stones that deteriorated before the building was complete. This added unexpected work and expense to an already demanding project. Safety was a constant concern. Workers labored at height on scaffolding that was basic and sometimes unstable. Heavy materials were hoisted overhead. Tools could slip. Accidents occurred, though detailed records of injuries during this period are scarce. The dangerous nature of the work was accepted as normal for major construction projects of the era. By 1797, the exterior walls stood essentially complete. The building's footprint and exterior form were established. The structure was becoming recognizable as the design Hoban had won the competition to build. But completing the exterior walls was only part of the work. The roof, the interior floors and partitions, the finishing work, all still lay ahead. Years of construction remained before the president's house would be ready for occupancy. The enslaved craftsmen, skills and contributions. Among the enslaved workers who labored on the president's house, some possessed specialized skills that made them valuable beyond basic physical labor. These craftsmen worked in trades that required years of training: carpentry, masonry, stone cutting, blacksmithing. Their contributions were essential to the building's construction, though their stories are often harder to recover from historical records than those of free workers. Enslaved carpenters worked on various aspects of the building's interior structure. Carpentry was one of the most common skilled trades for enslaved workers in the late 18th century. An enslaved person who learned carpentry could be hired out profitably by their owner. The skills also provided some degree of autonomy, as skilled craftsmen often worked with less direct supervision than unskilled laborers. The carpentry work on the president's house included framing interior walls, building floor structures, constructing roof framing, and creating staircases. This work required understanding structural principles, ability to read plans or receive complex instructions, and skill with hand tools. An enslaved carpenter on this project would have been doing work identical to that of free carpenters, though their compensation went to their owner rather than themselves. Some enslaved workers functioned as stonemasons or worked under the supervision of master masons. Masonry required particular skills, understanding how to lay stone or brick properly, how to work with mortar, how to maintain alignment and level. An enslaved mason might work alongside Freemasons, performing the same tasks but under different legal status. The historical record preserves some names of enslaved individuals who worked on the president's house, though the documentation is frustratingly incomplete. Payroll records mention payments to slave owners but rarely name the enslaved workers themselves. Cross-referencing various documents and careful historical research has recovered some names, but many remain unknown. One documented example involves payments to slave owners for Negro hire. The records specify amounts paid and sometimes durations of employment, but the enslaved individuals are usually identified only by first name or sometimes just by count: 3 Negro carpenters or 5 Negro laborers. This documentation style reflected the legal reality that enslaved people were property rather than individuals with full legal standing. The working conditions for enslaved craftsmen differed somewhat from those of unskilled enslaved laborers, though both groups remained in bondage. A skilled enslaved craftsman might have slightly better conditions because their specialized abilities made them more valuable to their owners. An injured or sick skilled worker represented greater economic loss than an unskilled laborer. This created some incentive for owners to provide adequate care, though the motivations were economic rather than humanitarian. Some enslaved craftsmen worked with considerable independence. A skilled carpenter or mason who knew his trade might receive assignments and complete them with minimal supervision. This relative autonomy was limited and could be revoked at any time, but it represented a small measure of control over daily work that unskilled laborers lacked. The relationship between free and enslaved craftsmen on the work site was complex. They performed similar work and needed to coordinate their efforts. A Freemason and an enslaved mason working on the same wall section had to communicate and cooperate, but their legal statuses created fundamental inequality that pervaded every interaction. Some free craftsmen employed on the project also owned enslaved workers whom they brought to the site. A free carpenter might work alongside enslaved carpenters he owned, all contributing to the same construction project. This arrangement was common in the period and region, but adds additional complexity to understanding the workforce dynamics. The skills that enslaved craftsmen possessed and developed on projects like the President's House were valuable but offered limited path to freedom. A highly skilled enslaved craftsman might hope to purchase his freedom eventually, though this required saving money from small allowances or side work, a nearly impossible task. Most skilled enslaved workers remained in bondage regardless of their abilities. The training that enslaved people received in skilled trades was sometimes formalized through apprenticeship-like arrangements, though the terms were different from traditional free apprenticeships. An enslaved youth might be assigned to learn carpentry or masonry from an older skilled worker, either enslaved or free. The training increased the young person's value to their owner but didn't change their enslaved status. The contribution of enslaved craftsmen to the President's House was substantial. Their skills, their labor, and their knowledge of their trades went into the building's construction. The carpentry work, the masonry, the various construction tasks they performed were essential to completing the building. Without their contributions, the project would have taken longer and cost more, assuming it could have been completed at all given the labor constraints of the period. Modern efforts to document and acknowledge these contributions have increased in recent decades. The White House Historical Association and other organizations have conducted research to recover names and document the role enslaved workers played in building the President's House. This work is ongoing and continues to reveal new information as historians examine archives and cross-reference documents. Plaques and educational materials at the White House now acknowledge that enslaved workers helped build the structure. This recognition, while it cannot change the historical injustice, provides some measure of acknowledgement that these individuals existed, contributed essential work, and deserve to be remembered as part of the building's history. The story of enslaved craftsmen working on the president's house illustrates the contradictions embedded in the young United States. The building was meant to house the president of a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality. Yet enslaved people, denied liberty and treated as unequal under law, built portions of that house. This contradiction was not unique to the president's house, but characterized much of American development in the period. Inside the design, rooms and layout. James Hoban's design for the president's house created a building with distinct public and private spaces arranged across 3 main floors. The layout reflected both functional needs and symbolic purposes. The house had to accommodate the president's family life while also serving as a venue for official entertaining and government business. The ground floor, partially below grade, contained service and utility spaces. Kitchens, storage rooms, servants' work areas, and mechanical spaces occupied this level. The arrangement kept service functions out of sight while keeping them accessible. Servants could move through the ground floor and serve upper rooms without being prominently visible in public spaces. The main floor, accessed by exterior stairs and an interior grand staircase, contained the principal public rooms. This floor was designed for entertaining, for official functions, and for conducting government business. The ceiling heights were greater than the other floors, creating more impressive proportions in the formal spaces. The East Room occupied a large area at the building's east end. This was designed as the largest room in the house, intended for receptions, public gatherings, and large entertainments. The room's size allowed it to accommodate significant numbers of guests. The space could be used for various purposes: receiving visitors, hosting events, or displaying items of interest. Adjacent to the East Room, Hoban planned what would become the Green Room, the Blue Room, and the Red Room, though these names came later. These smaller reception rooms could be used for more intimate gatherings or as staging areas for larger events. The rooms opened into each other, allowing for flow between spaces during entertainments. The state dining room occupied space on the opposite end of the main floor. This room was designed for formal dinners. The dimensions allowed for a large table that could seat significant numbers of guests for official dinners. The room's placement separated dining functions from the reception areas, providing some acoustic and functional separation. Between these major rooms, Hoban designed smaller spaces that served various purposes. Some rooms functioned as offices or workspaces. Others served as private meeting rooms or sitting areas. The layout provided flexibility while maintaining clear distinction between more public and more private zones. The second floor was intended primarily for private family quarters. Bedrooms, family sitting rooms, and personal spaces occupied this level. The separation between the public main floor and private second floor was important functionally and symbolically. The president's family needed space separate from the constant public access to lower floors. The second floor layout included a mixture of room sizes: larger bedrooms for the president and first lady, smaller bedrooms for children or guests, shared spaces where the family could gather privately. The arrangements could be modified somewhat as different families with different needs occupied the house, but the basic division between public and private floors remained consistent. The third floor, at attic level, provided additional bedrooms and storage. These spaces were less formally finished than lower floors. The rooms served various purposes over time: servants' quarters, storage, occasionally guest rooms. The lower ceiling heights and simpler finishes marked these as secondary spaces compared to the grand rooms below. Hoban's interior design drew on Georgian architectural principles. The emphasis was on symmetry, classical proportions, and restrained ornament. Door and window placements followed regular patterns. Ceiling heights, room dimensions, and spatial relationships all reflected classical design principles adapted to the building's specific functions. The central entrance hall ran through the building's core, providing circulation and organization. This space functioned as a distribution point, with doors opening to major rooms on either side. The hall's width and height made it impressive in its own right. Not merely a passageway, but a significant space that set the tone for the public rooms. Interior architectural details included classical elements, columns, pilasters, decorative moldings, carved mantels for fireplaces. These elements added visual interest and suggested permanence and dignity. The level of ornamental detail varied by room importance. The most public spaces received the finest finishing work. The building's interior structure used timber framing, common for the period. Floor joists, beams, and roof structure were all wood. The timber came from forests in the region, cut to dimension and assembled on site. The wooden structure would eventually become a vulnerability during the War of 1814 when the building burned, but during construction it was the most practical structural approach. The interior walls between major rooms were substantial, providing both structural support and acoustic separation. The walls between the grand rooms were typically brick or thick plaster over lath. This construction provided some sound dampening, important when multiple events or activities might occur simultaneously in different spaces. Fireplaces were essential for heating and were incorporated into most rooms. The chimneys rose through the building, with flues serving fireplaces on multiple floors. Each major room had at least one fireplace, often positioned prominently as both functional and decorative features. The mantels and surrounds were designed as significant architectural elements. Windows provided light and ventilation. The Georgian style favored regularly spaced windows in consistent patterns. The windows on the main floor were taller than those on other floors, emphasizing the piano, noble concept where the principal floor receives special architectural treatment. Window placement balanced the need for light with structural requirements and aesthetic composition. The interior finishing work would take years to complete. Plasterwork, woodwork, painting, all required skilled craftsmen and considerable time. Even after the building was technically habitable, finishing work continued. The gap between structural completion and aesthetic completion was significant, a reality that would affect the first occupants considerably. John Adams moves in, an unfinished house. In November 1800, President John Adams became the first president to occupy the president's house. The building was far from complete. Construction had been ongoing for 8 years, but finishing work remained extensive. Adams and his wife Abigail moved into what was essentially an active construction site. Adams arrived in Washington in late October or early November 1800. The federal government was making its official move from Philadelphia to the new capital. Congress would meet in the incomplete Capitol building. The president would occupy the incomplete president's house. The timing was driven by the Residence Act's schedule rather than by the building's actual readiness. The exterior of the president's house was largely complete. The stone walls stood. The roof was on. Windows and doors were installed. From outside, the building looked substantial and impressive, the grand structure Hoban had designed. But the exterior completion masked the unfinished state of much of the interior. Many rooms lacked plaster on the walls. The East Room, the grandest space in the house, was completely unfinished. No plaster, no paint, essentially just bare walls. Abigail Adams famously used the East Room to hang laundry to dry, the only practical purpose the enormous unfinished space could serve during that first winter. The main staircase was complete enough to be functional, but lacked finished railings and decorative elements. Some upstairs bedrooms were habitable, though barely. Other rooms remained unfinished shells. The Adams family occupied a partially completed house, making do with rooms that were functional enough, while workers continued construction and finishing in other areas. Heating was a significant problem. The house was enormous. Many fireplaces weren't yet functional because chimneys weren't finished or had problems. The few working fireplaces struggled to heat the vast spaces. Washington in winter was cold and damp. The Adams family reportedly found the house uncomfortable and difficult to keep warm. Abigail Adams wrote letters describing the house's condition. Her accounts provide valuable historical documentation of what the building was like during its first winter of occupancy. She noted the cold, the drafts, the unfinished rooms, the lack of furniture for many spaces. Her tone was often critical, though she understood they were pioneers dealing with a building that simply wasn't ready. Furniture was scarce. The federal government had limited budget for furnishing the president's house. Some furniture came from Philadelphia, moved from the president's residence there. But the quantity was insufficient for the many rooms. Some rooms stood completely empty. Others had minimal furnishing. The house felt cavernous and incomplete. The grounds around the house were undeveloped. The construction site remained visible, with materials, equipment, and work areas scattered around the property. Roads in the area were poor. The immediate environment was muddy when wet, dusty when dry. The grand setting Hoban had envisioned existed more as potential than reality in November 1800. Staff accommodations were limited. The ground floor service areas were functional but basic. Housing for servants and staff was inadequate for the number of people needed to operate even a partially functional president's house. The organization and operation of the household during that first winter was reportedly chaotic. Despite the difficulties, Adams attempted to use the house for official purposes. He received visitors, though entertaining was limited by the house's unfinished state. The partially completed public rooms could be used when necessary, but formal entertaining on any significant scale wasn't practical given the conditions. Adams's presidency ended in March 1801. He lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. Adams left Washington quickly after Jefferson's inauguration, meaning he occupied the president's house for only about 4 months. His time in the building was brief and largely unsatisfactory, given the incomplete state of the structure. The Adams occupancy established that the building was technically habitable, even if far from comfortable. Later presidents would occupy a house that, while still requiring ongoing work, was more complete and more functional. But Adams and Abigail were the pioneers, living in a grand but unfinished structure during that first winter. The experience highlighted the gap between ambitious architectural plans and practical reality. The president's house was designed to be impressive and dignified. In November 1800, it was impressive externally, but internally it was still very much a work in progress. The vision existed, but the execution remained incomplete. Workers continued construction and finishing work throughout Adams's occupancy and beyond. The presence of the president in the building complicated the work but didn't stop it. Construction crews and presidential household had to coexist in the same structure, with predictable complications and conflicts over space and access. The Adams experience established precedents about what was minimally necessary for the president's house to be occupied. Basic weatherproofing, some habitable rooms, functional fireplaces in essential spaces. These minimum conditions had been achieved by November 1800, allowing occupancy even though much work remained. Later occupants would benefit from additional finishing and would complete more of Hoban's original vision. Completing the vision, Jefferson's modifications. Thomas Jefferson became the third president and the second to occupy the president's house when he took office in March 1801. Jefferson had strong opinions about architecture and had submitted his own design in the original competition. Though his design hadn't been selected, his architectural interests would shape his approach to the building during his presidency. Jefferson found the house still incomplete when he moved in. The interior finishing work that had been barely begun during Adams's occupancy continued slowly. Jefferson took active interest in completing the building and modifying some aspects to suit his preferences and needs. His modifications would leave lasting marks on the structure. One of Jefferson's significant contributions was the development of the east and west terraces. Hoban's original design had included some provision for subsidiary wings or connections, but Jefferson expanded and formalized these elements. The terraces extended from the main house toward east and west, creating covered walkways and additional service spaces. The East Terrace and West Terrace served multiple purposes. They provided covered passages connecting the main house to support buildings. They created additional space for storage and service functions. They also improved the building's visual composition, extending its horizontal reach and connecting it more effectively to the surrounding landscape. The terrace design reflected Jefferson's interest in classical architecture. The covered walkways with classical columns referenced Roman and Italian precedents. Jefferson had traveled extensively in Europe and studied classical ruins. His architectural additions to the president's house drew on that knowledge and those aesthetic preferences. Jefferson also worked to complete interior spaces that had remained unfinished. The East Room finally received plaster and paint during his administration, though it remained sparsely furnished. Other rooms were finished and furnished gradually. The house became more complete and more functional during Jefferson's 8 years in residence. The grounds received attention as well. Jefferson was interested in landscape design and wanted the president's house to sit in appropriate surroundings. He worked on improving the immediate grounds, though major landscape development would come much later. Trees were planted, paths were laid out. The area around the house gradually became less construction site and more designed landscape. Jefferson modified some interior spaces to accommodate his interests and working style. He was particularly interested in natural history and maintained collections of specimens, maps, and scientific instruments. Rooms in the president's house were adapted to house these collections and to serve as working spaces for Jefferson's various intellectual pursuits. The building's functionality improved during Jefferson's presidency, partly through simple completion of planned elements, but also through modifications that addressed practical problems. The heating issues that plagued the Adams occupancy were partly addressed through completion of chimney systems and improved fireplace construction. The house became gradually more comfortable and more livable. Jefferson's democratic ideals influenced how he used the house. He was reportedly uncomfortable with excessive formality and preferred relatively accessible interactions with citizens. The house's grand scale and formal spaces existed in some tension with Jefferson's political philosophy. He navigated this tension by using the spaces more informally than some later presidents would. During Jefferson's presidency, the capital city itself developed gradually. The president's house was no longer an isolated structure in largely undeveloped terrain. Buildings appeared nearby. Pennsylvania Avenue developed into a recognizable street. The city imagined by L'Enfant and Washington began to take physical form, though still far from complete. The president's house benefited from this broader development. Better roads improved access. Nearby construction provided additional workforce when needed for ongoing work on the president's residence. The house began to exist in an actual urban context, rather than in relative isolation. Jefferson left office in 1809. By then, the president's house was substantially more complete than when Adams first occupied it. Interior spaces were finished. The terraces added functional space and architectural interest. The grounds were beginning to look designed rather than incidental. The building Hoban had designed was closer to realization. But Jefferson's tenure also demonstrated that the president's house would continue evolving. Each president would make modifications, driven by changing needs, tastes, and circumstances. Hoban's design provided the framework, but the building would never be truly finished in the sense of being static and unchanging. It would adapt continuously to the needs of its occupants and the nation they led. Fortsætter med kapitel 11-15 plus conclusion næste. Skal jeg fortsætte med de sidste kapitlerne om Burning, Reconstruction og Legacy? Retry? C. Ja. The War of 1812, British torch the President's House. On August 24, 1814, British forces entered Washington and set fire to multiple government buildings, including the President's House. The burning occurred during the War of 1812, a conflict between the United States and Britain that had been ongoing since June 1812. The attack on Washington represented retaliation for American burning of government buildings in York, the capital of Upper Canada, the previous year. President James Madison and his administration had received warnings that British forces were approaching. The American military attempted to defend Washington, but was defeated at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th. The loss left Washington essentially undefended. Madison and his cabinet fled the city. First Lady Dolly Madison remained at the president's house longer, working to save important documents and items before evacuating. Dolly Madison's actions during those final hours have become legendary. She reportedly oversaw the removal of important papers, including copies of the Declaration of Independence and other significant documents. She also ordered the rescue of the full-length portrait of George Washington, by Gilbert Stuart that hung in the state dining room. The painting was too large to remove easily, so the frame was reportedly broken and the canvas removed. The items Dolly Madison saved represented more than just valuable property. They were symbols of the young nation's history and continuity. Her determination to preserve these items, even as British forces approached, demonstrated both personal courage and understanding of their symbolic importance. The rescued Washington portrait remains in the White House today. After Dolly Madison's evacuation, British forces entered the President's house. Contemporary accounts suggest the soldiers found the house still set for dinner, with food and wine on the table. The British officers reportedly ate the prepared meal before beginning the destruction. This detail, whether fully accurate or somewhat embellished in later retellings, added to the narrative of the house's violation. The British set fires in multiple rooms throughout the building. They used combustible materials to ensure thorough burning. The wooden interior structure, floors, and roof framing burned intensely. The heat was sufficient to crack stone in some areas. The fire consumed furniture, interior finishes, and essentially everything combustible within the structure. The sandstone exterior walls survived largely intact. Stone doesn't burn, though extreme heat can damage it. The walls that had taken years to construct and position remained standing, though blackened by smoke and damaged by heat. The survival of the exterior walls would prove crucial for Reconstruction. Without them, rebuilding would have required starting essentially from nothing. The destruction extended to the terraces Jefferson had built. The wooden elements of these structures burned. Some portions collapsed. The damage was thorough and deliberate. The British intended to destroy the building as punishment and as a symbolic blow to American government. They succeeded in the destruction, but not in breaking American resolve. Other government buildings burned the same night. The Capitol building was torched, with both the House and Senate chambers destroyed. The Treasury building burned. The War Department building was targeted. The systematic destruction of government structures was meant to humiliate the United States and demonstrate British power. The burning occurred at night, and contemporary accounts describe the glow visible for miles. Weather reportedly helped limit the destruction. A thunderstorm moved through the area on August 25th, producing heavy rain and possibly a tornado. The rain helped extinguish fires that might otherwise have burned even more thoroughly. The storm also reportedly convinced British commanders to begin withdrawing from Washington, fearing being trapped by American forces gathering in the area. The British withdrawal left Washington a damaged city. The President's house stood as a burned shell. The Capitol was ruined. Multiple other structures were destroyed or damaged. The young nation's capital had been attacked and severely damaged. The psychological and symbolic impact was significant beyond the physical destruction. When Madison and other officials returned to Washington, they confronted the extent of the damage. The President's house was uninhabitable. The Madisons moved to temporary quarters, first at the Octagon House and later at other locations. The question immediately arose: rebuild or abandon Washington as the capital? Some suggested moving the capital to another city, perhaps Philadelphia or another established urban center. The decision to rebuild in Washington was significant. It represented determination that the capital would remain where it had been established, despite the British attack. Rebuilding the President's house became both practical necessity and symbolic act. Restoring the building would demonstrate that the United States would not be defeated or intimidated by the British action. James Hoban, the original architect, was brought back to oversee Reconstruction. Hoban had remained in Washington after the building's initial completion and had worked on other projects in the growing capital. His knowledge of the original structure made him the logical choice to direct rebuilding. He would essentially reconstruct his own design, working with the surviving exterior walls as the foundation. The burned President's house stood as a ruin through the remainder of 1814 and into 1815. The structure was unstable in places. Some assessment was needed to determine which portions could be salvaged and which required rebuilding. The delay between burning and beginning reconstruction allowed careful planning, but also extended the period when the damaged building stood as visible reminder of the British attack. The burning of the president's house in 1814 was traumatic for the young nation. The attack on the Capitol, the destruction of government buildings, the violation of the president's residence, all represented both practical loss and symbolic defeat. But the decision to rebuild, and to rebuild in the same location using the same basic design, represented resilience and determination. The president's house would rise again from its ashes. Rising from the ashes, Hoban returns to rebuild. Reconstruction of the president's house began in earnest in 1815. James Hoban returned to direct the rebuilding, working with the surviving exterior walls and essentially reconstructing everything else. The project would take approximately 3 years, with the house becoming habitable again by late 1817. The first step was assessing the damage and determining what could be salvaged. The exterior sandstone walls had survived but were smoke damaged and heat cracked in places. Some stone needed replacement. Other sections could be repaired and reused. The foundation was intact. The basic structure remained, but everything else required rebuilding. The interior had been completely destroyed. All the wooden framing, floors, stairs, everything combustible was gone. The rebuilding would essentially recreate the interior from the foundation up. This provided opportunity to make some improvements and modifications based on experience with the original structure. But the basic design would follow Hoban's original plans. Funding for reconstruction came through congressional appropriation. The cost was significant, though perhaps less than building entirely new would have been since the exterior walls survived. Congress allocated money in stages, with initial appropriations covering emergency stabilization and planning, followed by larger sums for actual reconstruction. The workforce for reconstruction included both returning workers who had built the original structure and new laborers and craftsmen. Some of the same challenges that faced original construction reappeared: sourcing materials, transporting them to the site, organizing skilled and unskilled labor. The work required essentially the same trades and skills as original construction. Stone for repairs came again from the Aquia Creek quarries. Replacement blocks had to match existing stone in appearance and properties. Matching color and texture required careful selection at the quarry. The stone cutters who shaped replacement blocks needed to match the original work's character, so repairs would blend with surviving original fabric. The interior framing used timber as the original had. The wooden beams, joists, and roof structure were rebuilt, following the original design, but with some improvements based on construction techniques that had developed or become better understood. The framing proceeded floor by floor, with each level providing platform for work on the level above. Plastering the interior walls proceeded after framing was complete. The plasterwork recreated the original room finishes, including decorative elements in the principal rooms. Skilled plasterers worked on the elaborate ceiling designs and the moldings that gave the formal rooms their architectural character. This work was time-consuming and required dry conditions to allow proper curing. Some modifications were incorporated during reconstruction. Hoban made improvements to mechanical systems and room arrangements based on experience with the original building. The changes were generally minor, refining rather than fundamentally altering the design. The goal was to restore the building to its intended function while correcting problems identified during its first use. The burned timbers and debris from the original interior had been cleared away before reconstruction began. This clearing revealed the extent of damage and allowed assessment of the foundation and lower portions of walls. The clearing work itself was substantial, requiring removal of massive quantities of charred wood, ash, and debris. As reconstruction progressed, the building gradually regained its form. The roof went on, making the structure weatherproof. Windows were installed in their original positions. Interior walls divided the space into rooms. The building's outline and basic character remained the same as before the fire, but everything was new construction replicating what had burned. The work proceeded through 1815, 1816, and into 1817. Progress was steady but required time. Rushing would risk poor workmanship or construction failures. Hoban supervised carefully, ensuring the rebuilding met proper standards and would be durable. By late 1817, the president's house was sufficiently complete for occupancy. President James Monroe and his family moved into the rebuilt structure. The house was functional, though some finishing work continued into 1818 and beyond. The building had been restored approximately 3 years after the burning. The reconstruction represented substantial achievement. A building that had taken 8 years to construct originally had been rebuilt in roughly 3 years. The survival of the exterior walls made this possible, providing the structural framework for rapid interior reconstruction. Without those surviving walls, the timeline and cost would have been considerably greater. The rebuilt President's House was fundamentally the same building Hoban had originally designed. The form, the proportions, the arrangement of spaces all followed the original plan. But it was also new, with all interior elements reconstructed. The building retained its original character, while being essentially rebuilt from the interior out. The successful reconstruction demonstrated American determination and capability. The British attack had damaged but not destroyed the Capitol. The willingness to rebuild the President's House and other government buildings showed that Washington would remain the capital. The rebuilt structures symbolized national resilience and commitment to the capital L'Enfant and Washington had envisioned. Why white? The paint and the name. The President's House had been constructed of Aquia Creek sandstone, which had a natural tan or light brown color. The exterior walls were this natural stone color when the building was first completed and occupied. The transformation to white occurred during the Reconstruction after the War of 1814, though the reasons and exact timing have some complexity in the historical record. The fire of 1814 left the exterior walls smoke-stained and damaged. The sandstone, while structurally sound, was discolored. The stone had darkened from smoke and in some areas showed effects of the intense heat. The walls needed attention beyond just structural repair. Some surface treatment would be necessary to restore the building's appearance. Whitewashing or painting stone buildings was not uncommon in the period. The treatment served multiple purposes. It protected the stone from weathering. It created a uniform appearance even when stones varied somewhat in color or quality. It provided a finished look that raw stone sometimes lacked, particularly when the stone had weathered or been damaged. The decision to paint the President's House white during Reconstruction was reportedly practical. The paint covered smoke damage and discoloration. It created a clean, uniform appearance. White paint was relatively inexpensive and readily available. The color also had symbolic appeal, suggesting freshness, purity, and renewal after the fire's destruction. The painting occurred during or shortly after the Reconstruction in 1815 through 1817. Sources vary on exact timing, but the building was painted white as part of the restoration work. The transformation was immediate and striking. The building that had been natural sandstone color became the white structure that would define its appearance going forward. The paint used was lead-based white paint, standard for the period. Lead paint was durable and provided good coverage. The toxicity of lead was not well understood at the time. Lead paint would continue to be used on the building for many years before its dangers became recognized and alternatives were developed. Maintaining the white appearance required periodic repainting. Weather, particularly Washington's humid summers and variable winters, degraded paint surfaces. The building needed repainting every few years to maintain its appearance. This ongoing maintenance became standard practice, with the building receiving new paint coats regularly. The name White House emerged gradually and didn't become official for many years. In the early 1800s, the building was typically called the President's House, or the Executive Mansion, in official documents. The informal name White House appeared in correspondence and newspapers, possibly as early as the 1810s or 20s, but wasn't universally adopted. The nickname White House was descriptive and straightforward. The building was painted white and was the President's House. The name distinguished it from the Capitol and other government buildings. The simplicity and memorability of White House made it stick in popular usage, even when official documents used more formal names. Theodore Roosevelt officially adopted the White House as the building's name in 1901. Before then, various names coexisted in both official and popular usage. Roosevelt's adoption of the name on official stationery and in White House communications made the White House the standard designation. The timing was significant, occurring over 80 years after the building was first painted white. The transformation to white was thus both physical and nominal. The building was painted white during Reconstruction after 1814. The name White House emerged gradually in popular usage over subsequent decades. Official adoption of the name came much later in the early 20th century. The white color and the name are both now so identified with the building that imagining it otherwise requires historical awareness. Some historical accounts suggest the building was painted white to cover fire damage, while others note that whitewashing stone buildings was common practice regardless. Both factors likely played roles. The fire damage made painting necessary or at least highly desirable. The choice of white paint was logical and had precedent. The result was a building that looked clean, fresh, and renewed. The white appearance has been maintained consistently since the 1815-1817 Reconstruction. Every president since Monroe has occupied a white building. The color has become so associated with the structure that the White House functions as synecdoche, the part representing the whole, referring not just to the building but to the presidency itself and the executive branch of government. The decision to paint the building white, initially practical and aesthetic, had lasting consequences. The color became defining. The informal name derived from that color eventually became official. A choice made during Reconstruction became permanent characteristic. The President's House became the White House through paint and time and popular adoption, expanding and modernizing, 19th century changes. After the Reconstruction of 1815 through 1817, the White House continued evolving through the 19th century. Various presidents made modifications, added technological improvements, and adapted the building to changing needs. The structure Hoban designed and rebuilt remained recognizable, but ongoing changes gradually transformed how it functioned and appeared. One of the most significant architectural additions came in the 1820s. The north portico, the columned entrance facing Pennsylvania Avenue, was completed in 1829 during Andrew Jackson's presidency. The portico had been part of Hoban's original design, but hadn't been built during initial construction or immediate reconstruction. Adding it completed the building's north facade as originally envisioned. The south portico, facing the grounds behind the building, was added in 1824 during James Monroe's presidency. Like the north portico, this had been planned but not executed during original construction. The semicircular portico with its columns created a distinctive south facade and provided covered outdoor space accessible from the main floor rooms. Both porticos were constructed following Hoban's original design concepts. The addition of these classical colonnaded porches enhanced the building's appearance and provided functional benefits. The north portico created a more impressive entrance sequence. The south portico provided sheltered outdoor access to the grounds. Both additions made the building more recognizably classical in character. Interior modifications occurred throughout the century. Various presidents redecorated rooms, changed furniture, modified room uses, and adapted spaces to their preferences and needs. The flexibility of the interior spaces allowed these changes without major structural alteration. Rooms could be repurposed, redecorated, or reorganized as needed. Technological improvements transformed how the building functioned. Running water and improved plumbing were gradually installed, replacing or supplementing the original simpler systems. The installation of indoor plumbing and water closets improved sanitation and convenience. These improvements occurred in stages across several decades as technology developed and was adapted to the building. Gas lighting was installed in the 1840s, replacing candles and oil lamps as the primary lighting sources. The gas system required infrastructure, pipes throughout the building, fixtures in rooms, connections to gas supply. The improvement provided better, more reliable lighting, particularly important for evening events and winter months when darkness came early. The gas lighting was eventually replaced by electric lighting. The White House received electricity in the 1890s, during Benjamin Harrison's presidency. The installation of electric wiring and fixtures was gradual. The family reportedly was initially hesitant about electricity, afraid to touch switches. The transition from gas to electric lighting took some years to complete throughout the building. Heating systems improved across the century. The original fireplace heating was supplemented and eventually partially replaced by central heating systems. These improvements made the building more comfortable during winter months, addressing one of the major complaints from early occupants. The heating systems required mechanical equipment, typically located in basement spaces, and distribution systems throughout the building. The grounds around the White House developed considerably during the 19th century. Gardens were designed and planted. The surrounding landscape was shaped into deliberate compositions rather than remaining incidental space around the building. Various first ladies took particular interest in the grounds, commissioning plantings and landscape improvements that reflected their tastes and interests. Security considerations led to some changes as the century progressed. The White House initially was relatively accessible, with public areas open to visitors with minimal restriction. As security concerns grew, particularly after presidential assassinations, access became more controlled. Gates, fences, and guardhouses were added or modified to regulate entry to the grounds while maintaining appropriate openness for a democratic institution. The expansion of the federal government and the presidency's growing administrative burden created pressure for more office space. The White House wasn't designed primarily as an office building, but presidents needed space to work and staff needed accommodations. Interior rooms were adapted for office use. The tension between the building's residential character and its function as executive office grew across the century. By the late 1800s, the White House showed the effects of continuous occupation and the cumulative impact of various modifications. The building needed maintenance and updating. The structure that had been rebuilt after 1814 had been in use for over 80 years. Wear was visible. Systems were aging. A more comprehensive renovation would be necessary in the coming century to address structural and functional issues. The 19th century modifications, taken together, represented ongoing adaptation of Hoban's design to changing needs and circumstances. The basic structure remained, but the building continuously evolved. Each addition or improvement responded to contemporary needs while building on what existed. The White House in 1900 was recognizably the building Hoban had designed, but had been modified substantially by decades of use and adaptation. Acknowledgement and legacy, remembering the builders. For most of American history, the contribution of enslaved workers to building the White House received little formal recognition. The historical narrative focused on presidents who occupied the building, architects who designed it, and the symbolic role it played in American government. The laborers, particularly the enslaved laborers, remained largely unnamed and unacknowledged. This began changing in the late 20th century as historians paid increasing attention to the role slavery played in building Washington and the nation's early infrastructure. Research into construction records, payroll ledgers, and other archival documents revealed the extent to which enslaved labor contributed to federal construction projects, including the President's House. The work of documenting enslaved workers' contributions has been painstaking. Many historical records didn't name enslaved individuals, referring to them only by count or as property of named owners. Cross-referencing various documents, examining payment records to slave owners, and carefully reconstructing work assignments has allowed historians to recover some names and document some individual contributions. The White House Historical Association has been particularly active in this research. The organization has sponsored scholarly work, examining construction records, and supporting efforts to identify enslaved workers by name where possible. The goal has been to move beyond acknowledging slavery's role generally to documenting specific individuals' contributions whenever records allow. Some names have been recovered. Historical research has identified certain enslaved individuals who worked on the White House by name, occupation, and in some cases by specific work they performed. These names represent only a fraction of the enslaved workers who contributed to construction, but each recovered name represents an individual whose story can be told and whose contribution can be acknowledged. In recent decades, the White House has incorporated this history into its educational programs and public communications. Tours discuss the building's construction and acknowledge that enslaved workers were part of the workforce. Educational materials available on the White House website address the topic directly. The goal is historically accurate presentation that neither sensationalizes nor minimizes the role slavery played. Physical recognition has been added as well. In 2017, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History erected a historical marker acknowledging enslaved workers' contributions to building the White House. The marker provides public recognition at the site where the labor occurred. Such markers serve educational purposes and provide tangible acknowledgement of historical reality. The National Park Service, which helps maintain White House grounds, has incorporated this history into its interpretive programs. Rangers and guides discussing the White House's history now routinely include information about the diverse workforce, including enslaved workers who built it. This represents evolution in how American historical sites present complex and sometimes uncomfortable history. Academic research continues expanding understanding of early Washington construction and the labor systems that built the Capitol. Scholars examine archives, uncover new documents, and cross-reference information to reconstruct more complete pictures of who worked on major projects and under what conditions. This ongoing research continues revealing new information. The effort to acknowledge enslaved workers' contributions represents broader reckoning with slavery's role in American history. The White House, as the nation's most symbolic residence, presents particular challenges and opportunities. Acknowledging that enslaved people helped build it requires confronting uncomfortable contradictions at the heart of American founding. The building was meant to house presidents of a nation founded on liberty and equality. Yet enslaved people, denied liberty and treated as property, helped construct it. This contradiction isn't unique to the White House, but characterizes much early American development. Federal buildings, infrastructure, and institutions were built partly through slave labor, even as the nation proclaimed universal principles of freedom. Modern acknowledgement can't change historical injustice, but it can ensure the history isn't forgotten or minimized. The enslaved workers who helped build the White House existed as real individuals with skills, lives, and families. Their contributions were essential. Their stories, to the extent they can be recovered, deserve telling. The legacy of the White House's construction is thus complex. The building represents American democracy and presidential tradition. It also represents compromises with slavery that were embedded in the nation's founding. Both aspects are historically true. Understanding the building's full history requires acknowledging both. Visitors to the White House today encounter a building with over 200 years of history. The structure has housed every president since John Adams. It has been the setting for crucial decisions, historic events, and countless daily operations of American government. But it also stands as physical reminder that the nation's founding ideals and founding realities didn't always align. The ongoing research into enslaved workers' contributions and the increasing public acknowledgement of this history represent progress toward more complete historical understanding. The White House's story includes not just presidents and architects, but also the diverse workforce, free and enslaved, whose labor made the building possible. Telling that complete story serves historical accuracy and honors all who contributed. The White House stands today as one of the world's most recognized buildings. The neoclassical facade, the white columns, the carefully maintained grounds, all create an image of stability, tradition, and democratic governance. Over 200 years of history have shaped both the building and its meaning. But the White House's story begins not with presidents or ceremonies, but with construction. The building rose from swampy ground along the Potomac through years of difficult labor. The timeline from cornerstone to first occupancy stretched 8 years. The work was demanding, dangerous, and difficult. The building we see today represents thousands of hours of human effort. That effort came from diverse sources. Free craftsmen brought skills learned through apprenticeship in America and Europe. Immigrants sought opportunity in the growing capital. Enslaved workers, compelled without choice or compensation, provided essential labor. All contributed to raising the structure. The building exists because of their work, regardless of whether they labored freely or in bondage. James Hoban's design provided the framework, a Georgian structure adapted to Republican purposes. The design balanced grandeur with restraint, creating a building impressive enough to represent a nation, but not so grand as to suggest monarchy. The balance was deliberate and reflected the political sensibilities of the young United States. The building's survival of the 1814 burning and its subsequent reconstruction demonstrated resilience. The decision to rebuild rather than relocate the capital was significant. The restored building, painted white, emerged from destruction to become the structure we recognize today. The burning and reconstruction are as much part of the building's history as its original construction. The White House has evolved continuously since completion. Porticos added architectural character. Technological improvements transformed how the building functioned. Interior modifications adapted spaces to changing needs. The structure Hoban designed has been modified by every era since, each leaving its mark while respecting the original framework. The building's meaning has evolved as well. Initially just the President's House, it has become the White House, a name now official and universal. The building represents not just presidential residence, but American executive power generally. The White House announces policies, makes statements, serves as sine qua for the presidency itself. Understanding the White House's full history requires acknowledging complexity and contradiction. The building represents democratic ideals. It also was built partly through slave labor, a fact that complicates its symbolism. Both aspects are historically true. Neither should be emphasized at the expense of the other. Complete history embraces complexity. The modern efforts to acknowledge enslaved workers' contributions represent important historical work. Research continues recovering names and documenting individual contributions. This work serves accuracy and honors those whose labor was essential but long unrecognized. The White House's story includes everyone who built it, free and enslaved. For contemporary visitors, the White House functions as museum, symbol, and working residence simultaneously. Tours allow public access to rooms where history unfolded. The building operates continuously as the president's home and workplace. These functions coexist, with the building serving multiple purposes that sometimes exist in tension. The White House will continue evolving. Future occupants will make modifications. Technology will advance, requiring new systems and capabilities. The building will adapt while maintaining connection to its origins. This continuity amid change has characterized the structure since completion, and will likely continue indefinitely. The White House's most important legacy may be its demonstration that significant public buildings can endure across centuries while remaining functional and relevant. The structure built between 1792 and 1800 still serves its original purpose over 2 centuries later. This longevity is remarkable and speaks to the quality of Hoban's design and the skill of those who built it. The building connects present to past tangibly. The stone walls standing today include blocks quarried and shaped in the 1790s. The rooms where current presidents work and live are the same spaces Hoban designed. The building provides physical continuity across American history, a structure that has witnessed and housed over 200 years of presidential governance. If you found this exploration of the White House's construction and history valuable, please consider subscribing for more documentaries about American architectural and historical subjects. Thank you for watching.